Hey everybody, this is for the week of April 27th through May 1st, our last week. Can you believe it? We enter the realm of living memory now, the Obama years and of course the Trump years, our current administration. So let's talk about Barack Obama today.
We're gonna spread happiness. We're gonna spread freedom. Obama's gonna change it. Obama's gonna lead 'em. We're gonna change it and rearrange it. We're gonna change the world. Now's the moment where he's forced to sing. Sing with all your heart. For our children, for our families, nations all join as one. Sing for joy and sing abundant peace. Courage, justice, love. Sing together, hold each precious hand, lifting each other up. Sing for vision, sing for unity, lifting our hearts to sing.
The Sing for Change kids from the Obama campaign in 2008. What a different world it was. What was it about the Obama campaign and the promise of him as a president that made everyone so optimistic? I think at the heart of it was the guarantee that we really could rise above politics as usual, as it had been for centuries. And the one line in the song, all nations as one. Wow. It has this sort of apocalyptic hope to it. No longer would it be about ideology and partisanship. No, the future was going to be this new step in how to be human and how to organize a whole national community. Did it work? Let's think about that today. Who was Barack Obama? Everybody kind of knows his unusual story. Born in Hawaii, contrary to conspiracy theories, there is a birth certificate. Grew up in some strange places. Indonesia for a little while, the American Midwest. Finally settled in Chicago after attending Harvard Law School, and got involved with community organization in the south side of Chicago, and fell in with the radical left as it existed in the mid-1970s. At that point, it was kind of tapering off from what it had been in the 60s. He knew Bill Ayers, and this friendship with Bill Ayers came to be a bit of a problem for his future career, as a lot of critics pointed out. Bill Ayers was a real radical from the 60s. Whether or not Obama actually took everything about the far left seriously, though, that's a bit of a mystery. But yeah, became very involved with a lot of community activism, starting at, like we said, at Harvard, and then in Chicago, organizing groups to try to pressure government to either repeal bad laws or pass new ones, and realized that there really were ways that the people as an organization could get what they wanted. And so that's kind of the basic premise of radical politics in this era. And in a lot of ways, it wasn't really all that radical. It was what Americans had always done, organizing for desired, necessary social change. And so he kind of took this philosophy with him pretty far. And by the time he became president, he maintained much of that same idea that community organization really could happen on a national level. He met Michelle, and they had a very happy, stable marriage. As we've seen so many instances of presidents where the allure of power can really kind of corrupt their marriage and their faithfulness, not the Obamas. And to this day, they continue to have a very happy, stable family life. And their two daughters. Michelle herself, much like Hillary Clinton, became very prominent in certain aspects of public policy. She never drafted a big grandiose healthcare plan the way Hillary did, but she was involved with certain aspects of Obamacare, especially the Let's Move campaign and attempts to get kids outside and exercising as a method of preventative medicine. And so, yeah, she was sort of on the sidelines of a great deal of the policy and became, a strong supporter of certain aspects of Barack Obama's policy. And rumors always swirl about the possibility of her running for president in the future, though it doesn't seem all that likely. It's been interesting, though, the relationship she's cultivated with other political figures. We talked about her thoughts on George W. Bush, claiming that we have the same values, she said of him recently. And so there's been a great deal of outreach between Michelle Obama and a lot of the old school Republicans in recent years because they are such a striking contrast, of course, with Donald Trump. Get to that later. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2005 from the state of Illinois and became a prominent figure within the Democratic bloc within the U.S. Senate, opposed a great deal of the expenditures in the war in Iraq, and took a hard line on many of the progressive causes. And he was, of course, the keynote speaker at the Democratic National Convention in 2004 when John Kerry received the nomination. In that speech, he said something that really stuck for his future political career and kind of gave a new articulation to a new possibility of what progressivism meant in American politics. He said in that speech, "In the end, that's what this election is about. Do we participate in the politics of cynicism or the politics of hope? Cynicism versus hope. That's the great question. Cynicism is the kind of politics that says that politics will never change, that it's always going to be ideological and partisan, that the system of checks and balances just sort of accepts that we can never transcend it, that our approach to politics is just rooted in human nature in a very ancient sense." No way, said Obama. No, we can get over that. There is a politics of hope. We can look to the hope of what our nation can be. We can rise above what we are. He said, "I'm not talking about blind optimism here. No. I'm talking about something much more substantial. It is the hope of slaves sitting around the fire singing freedom songs. It's the hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores. It's the hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta." That's, of course, John Kerry. It's the hope of a mill worker's son who dared to defy the odds. The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too. That's, of course, himself. Hope is in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty, audacity of hope, audacity, like the boldness of hope, the courage of hope. In the end, that is God's greatest gift to us, the bedrock of this nation, a belief in things not seen, a belief that there are better days not ahead. Of course, he's quoting the Bible there. So, yeah, the hope that we can rise above. This was the idea that he really unpacked in his intellectual autobiography that was immensely popular by 2005, 2006, The Audacity of Hope, his book. We'll look at a few passages of it as we move along. But he really did have a very comprehensive idea about not just what progressivism could be, but what all of Americans could be, that we could transcend politics as usual. And it was the sole duty of the president to ensure that that happened. Wow, what an idea. And so, as 2008 approached, he announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. And of course, he was up against John Edwards, who had been John Kerry's running mate in 2004, and of course, Hillary Clinton, who had been a senator from New York through the Bush years, and of course, former First Lady. Hillary ran a very strong campaign in 2008, much stronger than she did in 2016. She emphasized public policy, she emphasized foreign affairs, she emphasized her experience being a senator, having been First Lady, and that was her major selling point. But as the nomination progressed, her emphasis on experience started to work against her, because a lot of people heard experience as not that you know the ins and outs of how politics works, but that you're stuck in the rut of American politics. Obama presented a way out of that rut. Hillary just seemed to grant that it would always be there. And so they were actually neck and neck right up until the Democratic Convention in that year in 2008. And she actually showed up not entirely sure if she had lost the nomination, and there was suspicion that she was going to maybe demand it. Who knows what would happen? she thought she banked everything on the Democratic superdelegates, who she was very close to, and she was very much a Democratic Party insider. Obama was the outsider, and in the 11th hour, the Democratic convention, the superdelegates, switched their nomination over to Obama. Sorry, they said, she's just the stronger candidate. The Republicans chose John McCain. And it was a very strange nomination process for the Republicans. They had way more candidates, like 8 of them, I think. And then, of course, by 2016, they had like 16 of them, as we'll see here for next time. But yeah, John McCain slowly rose to the top, and this was his second run for the presidency. Remember, he ran against George W. Bush in 2000 in the primary and lost because he just refused to do the crazy fundraising that Bush was willing to do. And this really embedded in McCain's mind that it's all about the money. No, we've got to rise above the money. And so McCain was really set on making this a straight talk campaign, just like he had done back in 2000. And he had a lot going for him. He was, of course, a war hero, as we mentioned, and seemed to be the strongest possible candidate that the Republicans could muster at the time. But to add to that, McCain was a classy politician. He didn't play dirty, whether it came to money or otherwise. He wanted to be fair. He wanted to make sure that the election was a democratic process, small d, democratic, that the people actually chose based on their own best judgment about who should be president. He made one fatal mistake, though. While McCain was a classy politician, very much a gentleman in the style of politics, he chose an attack dog that turned out to backfire pretty bad for him. And that was, of course, the Alaska governor, Sarah Palin. And right away after he chose her, he thought maybe he had made a bit of a mistake. But because Palin took a really hard line. She was very tough, very outspoken, and yet she didn't really seem to know a lot about politics, about world affairs. And so the infamous Katie Couric interview, where she just sort of bumbled her way through everything. She didn't know what the actual ruling in Roe versus Wade was. She said that, oh yeah, I know a lot about Russia because I can see it from my house in Alaska. Oh, what to do about this person? Still, though, she did appeal to a certain base within the Republican Party, which, as we know, became very important by 2016, the sort of zero-sum, very hard-line right wing of the Republican Party, not the conventional conservatives. So not the Reaganites, not the Tea Party people, not the compassionate conservatives, certainly not the types that John McCain appealed to, but much more of the sort of radical take-no-prisoner style of Republicans. She, indeed, is largely responsible for stirring up the base early on that became Donald Trump's base by 2016. Barack Obama, on the other hand, chose longtime Senator Joe Biden. Biden, you'll recall, was one of the key figures of the left within the U.S. Senate, especially when it came to Senate confirmation hearings. In a lot of ways, he was more of a conventional progressive, whereas Obama was the new novel sort of progressive. And so it was Obama and Biden. His time as vice presidency might have been the end of Biden's career, but of course, as we know, he has announced his candidacy for 2020, even though he's quite up in age. So yeah, we'll talk about Biden's role through the course of Obama's presidency. Controversy, though, through the course of this election, especially with the Obama campaign, the biggest problem that emerged was Obama's pastor, Jeremiah Wright, of Trinity Church in the south side of Chicago, this big, very old black church in Chicago. And Jeremiah Wright had been pretty well known, actually, for years for saying these really inflammatory things about America, very, very condemning of American history, of American society. And his sermons were all over YouTube. But it was pretty late in the campaign that ABC News suddenly jumped on Jeremiah Wright and played this clip over and over and over again. No, 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 said Wright. Not God bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible, apparently. I don't know where that is, but for killing innocent people, I guess. God damn America for treating our citizens as less than human. Slavery. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she's God and she is supreme. Presumably a reference to Bush foreign policy. The United States government has failed the vast majority of her citizens of African descent. And that clip was played everywhere. What to do about this? Obama was really stuck. And so, in response to Jeremiah Wright, he finally had to give his speech, a More Perfect Union speech from 2008. And everybody who was on the inside of the campaign said Obama did not want to give this speech at all. He didn't want to talk about race. And he really didn't want to talk about Jeremiah Wright, but the media was going crazy with it. So finally he responded. In that speech, he says this: the remarks that have caused this recent firestorm weren't simply controversial. They weren't simply a religious leader's effort to speak out against perceived injustice. Instead, they expressed a profoundly distorted view of this country, a view which sees white racism as endemic, and that elevates what is wrong with America above all we know is right with America. That we are always aspiring to be something better than what we are, right? This was very tricky because Obama had actually dedicated his book to Jeremiah Wright. He said he could not disown Jeremiah Wright any more than he could disown his mother. What to say about this? This was the only time he addressed race. And he kind of said, well, that's one guy's opinion, but here's what I know America to be. Did it work? Yeah. He rose above the controversy, just the way he planned to. And so the campaign moved on. What did John McCain do with all of this? A lot of Republican Party insiders, a lot of strategists says you've got to exploit the Jeremiah Wright thing. But what did McCain say? No way. I'm not going to talk about the guy's religion. Again, McCain, always classy, always above the drama. As Obama was too. It was indeed very much a gentleman's election in that way. The other controversy was a little more ridiculous. The birth certificate. Where's the birth certificate? The birthers. This really caught on because there were rumors that he hadn't actually been born in the United States, and for that reason, he was barred for holding the presidency because Article 2 requires that the president be a natural-born citizen. And so this huge push to produce the birth certificate, that this legal technicality really disqualified him from the presidency. And guess who really got in on the birther movement? One of the most prominent figures was New York real estate tycoon Donald Trump. Trump went crazy with this, insisting that he produce the birth certificate. We'll come back to Trump later. There was a follow-up with the birth certificate. There actually was one from the state of Hawaii. And Obama just kind of let the critics spin their wheels about the birth certificate and go crazy about it. Well into his presidency about 2011, he produced it, showed it to the media. Okay, done. And of course, the conspiracy theorists insisted, oh, no, it's a forgery, it's fake. Well, at that point, what can you say? Of course, a lot of other conservatives, a lot of mainline critics of the Obama administration said, who cares? What does this have to do with public policy? Aren't we kind of losing focus here? So we'll come back to that. One of the most interesting tactics, though, that Obama had when it came to campaigning was the community organization aspect. Like we said, having worked in the South Side of Chicago, having worked closely with Bill Ayers, he put a lot of thought into how you could organize large groups of people to bring community action at the local level. What if you could do it on the national level for a campaign? And so a great deal of his campaign wasn't just him campaigning and giving speeches and his staff and all of that. It was armies of volunteers all over the country, going door to door, telling people, get to the polls and vote. Because, of course, the biggest problem in so many campaigns isn't so much that people don't vote for you, it's that they would vote for you, they just forget to go to the polls on that day. Turnout is a major issue. And so the Obama campaign was very careful to make sure that turnout was kept high. And this was coordinated through a very important organization, Organizing for America, it was called, OFA. And it stuck around all the way through his presidency. And it was very instrumental in organizing people to write their members of Congress, organizing people to organize even more, to try to sway public opinion, to engage conversation, to get people to support his policies, especially the healthcare bill. The most ingenious thing of all, though, of the Obama campaign was without a doubt his website. It was very carefully designed. It was consulted with psychologists that study the effects of shades of blue and gray and how they made you perceive things. And of course, standing out was the big red button that said, donate. Remember, Howard Dean, back in 2004, had pioneered this. The online donation. So while most donations were still collected through events or by mail, Howard Dean was the first one to do it online. His campaign fell apart, remember, after the Dean Scream, as it was called back in 2004, but the Obama campaign really planned ahead for this and made sure that online donations were always flowing in. What kinds of donations? Well, federal election law put a cap on how much you could give per month. Most of Obama's donations, though, really weren't that big. He managed to get lots and lots and lots of small donations. That was very important because his website was set up so if you did give a small donation, you would then get a password to log into his website, and you would get exclusive content. Depending on how much you gave or how many times you gave per month, or each month, Obama would give you a special message thanking you. There was a kind of social media feed in the Obama campaign website, and of course, there was an app for your iPhone. He was 10 steps ahead of the McCain campaign on this. And you would get texts about campaign events, about campaign stops, about how you could volunteer. And so the organization of this campaign just snowballed. People and volunteers, little tiny donations would get you exclusive access that would then get you involved. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. Meanwhile, the McCain campaign had this clunky, complicated, strange website, and you look and look and look, and it's hard to find the donate button. Of course, McCain didn't believe in that kind of fundraising. He didn't want to do that. Most of McCain's constituency was older people anyway, and they weren't all that internet savvy. And so a lot of his campaigning, much like Republicans before him, was still by mail. So Obama just ran circles around John McCain on this. And then when it came to the campaign route, he ended up campaigning not only in the critical swing states, but in states where he knew he was going to lose, and in certain counties within those states where McCain was actually leading. And he campaigned so aggressively there that he ended up turning some of those counties to his favor. Meanwhile, the McCain campaign was just kind of wandering the country. McCain would forget what city he was in frequently. He got tired and haggard looking. Obama, on the other hand, was just booming with this campaign and doing extremely well. As 2008 progressed in the final months of the election, the crisis with the economy got so bad that both Obama and McCain, in their capacity as U.S. senators, returned to Washington for the summit with President George W. Bush to talk about the bailouts. And this was the agreement where Bush and members of Congress agreed to the initial round of bailouts. And then, of course, more came later with the Troubled Asset Relief Program. But Obama kind of took charge of the meeting. It was very clear that he was going to be quite presidential even before he was president. But of course, what stands out the most with this campaign and the 2008 election was just the support, the massive swell of public opinion, the rallies in major cities in favor of Obama. He just seemed to be this almost messianic figure to people. Kids singing to him, like we saw a minute ago, people fainting in the audience, Chris Matthews of MSNBC claiming that he got a tingle in his leg every time Obama spoke. And indeed, he was extremely eloquent. We'll look at a few clips later. He was very moving. He had that beautiful voice. He had this very wonderful way of putting his words. He never bumbled through a speech the way George W. Bush always did. And the media, of course, was very much on his side, always taking pictures of him with the light behind his head so he had a halo, always presenting him in this extremely inspiring way. This was change. This was the way out of politics as usual. And so, sure enough, 2008, it was not even midnight when it was called for Obama. It was clear that he had it. Florida, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the swing states going to him, at least on the eastern part of the United States. And then, of course, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, it was done. He very squarely beat John McCain. How to define Obama's presidency? What exactly was his leadership style? It's very interesting to compare him with past presidents. He likes to compare himself to Abraham Lincoln. He even met Abraham Lincoln. No, he didn't. It's an impersonator. But this impersonator in Illinois, who was actually quite good, got up on stage at an Obama rally and gave his endorsement. Obama announced his candidacy in Springfield, Illinois, and talked about Lincoln's legacy, about the way that Lincoln brought America back to its own first principles. And he was quite correct about that. Others, though, said, well, actually, if you think about it, he was a lot more like progressives, especially Franklin Roosevelt. Isn't what he is presenting here the new New Deal, a new way, not so much for how Americans to be Americans, that might have been the mood of the campaign, but much more than that, of the role of government in shaping American life. So, who was he more like? The other major question, too, had to do with his sort of approach to making policy and trying to persuade Congress of policy. And that was, of course, his pragmatism. Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush had been ideologues. They believed in their principles. They took their principles and stood on them and then presented them to Congress and say, here's what I'm going to give you. Here's what we have to work with. Take it or leave it. If you have better principles, okay, make your case. And we'll talk about it. But I'm not going to back down on my principles. Obama actually sort of admired that. But it didn't always work, at least not in a post-Cold War world. He said in Audacity of Hope, pride in our country, respect for our armed services, a healthy appreciation for the dangers beyond our borders, an insistence that there is no easy equivalence between East and West. In all these, I had no quarrel with Ronald Reagan. And when the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, I had to give the man his due, even if I never gave him my vote. Yeah, ideology worked in the Reagan years because that's just the way the world and the way the United States was. But that's over now. Now it's about experimentation. It's about pragmatism. I think in some ways that's also what Bill Clinton was, although triangulation wasn't exactly the same thing. Triangulation for Bill Clinton was, I can change my ideology. Yes, I'm an ideologue if it serves my purposes, but I'll change that if I have to make people like me. That seemed to be Clinton's main obsession, really, was consolidating support for him and his presidency and his leadership. Obama was different, though. His pragmatism was more a matter of, I don't know what the answer is. And the only way forward, though, is to take the best of both ideologies, of the left and the right, of Democrats and Republicans. There he is with John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi on either side of him. Let's combine the best ideas of both sides, and that's the way forward with progress. Clinton in later years said, oh, that's what I should have said. Oh, well. But Obama was much more clear and persuasive about it. Don't get stuck on ideology. Know how to figure out what works and go with that. And so the big lingering question, did that work? Was Obama really a pragmatist? Or was there a bit more of ideology to him than we realize? Or what's more likely, did he try to rise above ideology and yet find himself pulled back down by ideology? The measure of so many presidents in their early days was, of course, the first 100 days expectation that had been in place ever since Franklin Roosevelt, when he first unveiled the New Deal. Same thing with Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Same thing primarily with Democrats, but some Republicans too. Well, Obama had a plan for that. The New Foundation was the plan for the first 100 days. That brief period when the president enjoys kind of a honeymoon period with the American people, with Congress, where he can get a lot of what he wants early on. Did it stick? Do we remember the New Foundation? Anyone heard of this compared to the New Deal or the Great Society? No, actually it didn't. Why not? A large part of the reason was that his lofty ideas about pragmatism, again, of just doing what works, sort of ran head on with real politics and the fact that political divisions and ideology aren't that easy to overcome. And it was really thought that his inspiring speeches, his eloquence, his willingness to transcend politics as usual would appeal to everyone, that both the left and the right, especially in Congress, would give up their ideologies and follow his lead. He found out very quickly it wasn't that simple. Ideology is actually quite rigid. His hope was that those who were ideologues, especially among Republicans, they would just sort of tie their own rope. He would present the way forward, everyone would see the light. Those that didn't, well, the American people would see that as their failing, and they would hear the public pressure, they would be voted out of office, no problem. Didn't quite work out that way for him, though. The first order of business was, of course, what to do about failing banks. They had to come and testify before Congress, admitting their practices, admitting the things that they had done, especially with those subprime mortgages with adjustable interest rates. They allowed, within their own banks, the bankers to give out these loans to people who would not be able to pay them back, or maybe they would pay it back for the first 5 years, and then once the adjustable interest rate kicked in, they would see their mortgage payments quadruple, Oh no, what did we do? And the bank said, well, it's an adjustable interest rate. What did you expect? They walked away, foreclosures upon foreclosures of these homes, and finally the banks caved. And so they had to come before Congress and admit all of this in a sort of confession to Congress, to the American people, of their reckless lending habits. Well, what to do? Do you just let them fold because of their irresponsibility? Well, remember, for Bush, it was more a matter of, okay, quick bailouts because we don't even want to think about what this will do to the overall economy. This is the kind of thing that could trigger a recession that could drift into a depression. So, what's the answer? Well, Bush gave his initial round of bailouts, but then came the Troubled Asset Relief Fund. Taxpayers now are going to bail out the failed banks. Doesn't matter, right, of how bad off taxpayers are. We have to save the economy. And so the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, was unveiled in the early days of 2009. Timothy Geithner, Treasury Secretary, had to come before Congress to explain the plan, which went from the initial round was $300 billion, now it's $700 billion. And there were protests in the galley, people saying, what are you doing with our money? We should let the banks fail. But still, it just seemed necessary to prop the banks up and also to bail out some of the homeowners. Those who qualified could have a bailout that could save their homes and let them stay in their homes. Still, though, isn't this kind of rewarding reckless irresponsibility? The other major part was of the first 100 days was, of course, the stimulus package. Part of it was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This idea that was very prominent in the Obama administration of public investment. Yeah, we know what private investors are. They hold stocks and bonds in private companies. But what about a public investment? Isn't it possible that the government can also invest in things which in turn are very good at propping up the economy? The most basic thing is, of course, infrastructure. And so the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act invested in roads and bridges and all kinds of things. This is indeed very much like the Works Progress Administration back in Franklin Roosevelt's years. And it also put a lot of people back to work. People who worked for all kinds of construction crews and construction companies were now put to work in repaving roads, fixing up all kinds of infrastructure. That in turn would create jobs in the short run, but also stimulate the economy because of more trade and more roads, most more basic thing that government exists to do. One of the more intriguing things, though, one of the more interesting aspects of public investment wasn't so much infrastructure as it was green jobs. This became very important for the Obama administration because it tended to take care of two different public policy questions at once. First of all, how do you create jobs to stimulate the economy? And how do you address environmental concerns, especially about energy, especially about climate change? And so the Obama administration proposed that the government invest a bunch of money in people who manufactured solar panels and big windmills like the ones you see over in Madison. And of course, electric cars. That would, again, meet two different public policy problems at once. It would address climate change, it would develop alternate energy sources, and it would create jobs. And so you see in that Obama's attempt at, again, his pragmatism, that you can combine, two different questions into an answer. You can solve multiple problems at once. You can use the market economy, especially with public investment, and that in turn would solve problems like climate change. And so one of the most important investments of all that the federal government made at Obama's prompting was in Solyndra company that manufactured solar panels. And so Solyndra had this huge grant of money from the federal government that would offset the cost of solar panels, especially for consumers. Consumers too could buy, homeowners could buy solar panels cheaper, also using government subsidies, and that in turn would diminish their heating bill in the winter. They would charge up batteries in their garage that would offset their electricity bill. This was the way forward. And one of the most important things that the Obama administration invested in was, of course, Chevrolet. The electric car could run on a battery that you could charge, And when it was on the street, it was basically like a golf cart. It would only the engine would only kick in and start burning gas once you were on the freeway, and this would be a great source of alternate fuel. Japanese cars like the Prius had been around for some time. Okay, why don't we invest in American companies? Chevrolet comes out with their fleet of cars every year, and but consumers just aren't interested in electric cars. All right, how about the Volt? It's not a very pretty car, but then again, neither is the Prius. But still, it was an opportunity for consumers to feel like they were being responsible with gas prices and with energy. And so the Chevy Volt makes its way onto the roads. What happened with some of these public investments? Well, who ended up buying Chevy Volts? Only people who felt that level of responsibility. What happened with Solyndra? After receiving $535 million, it turned out that they didn't keep their books right, that there was embezzlement and fraud, and the FBI raided their offices and they declared bankruptcy. Huge embarrassment for the Obama administration. So all of this raised a lot of doubts about the possibility of public investment. Maybe real investments are not the federal government giving huge $500 million grants to companies, so much as it is private investors. They're the ones who actually take a risk in a way that government doesn't. When government gives this kind of money, it tends to cause recklessness on companies' behavior, and that leads to major fraud and bankruptcy. Obama's signature achievement, though, is, of course, the Obamacare law, the Affordable Care Act, which came to be called Obamacare later. Through the course of the Bush presidency, back to Bill Clinton's presidency, there had been a lot of attention on this issue, the spiraling costs of healthcare. Why is it so expensive? Is there anything government can do to try to bring down the cost of healthcare in the United States? Clinton, of course, had First Lady Hillary Clinton go to work on her proposal, which ended up flopping in Congress. But again, it wasn't so much what the plan proposed as the way Hillary approached it. The fact that she designed it behind closed doors, the fact that she tried to get it through Congress without really explaining certain details about it. Others would say, of course, it was sexism, that there was a lot of animosity against Hillary. That might be true as well. But then, George W. Bush confronted the question too. He was the one who opened up government subsidies for at least prescription drugs. But still, the big lingering question about healthcare is, what about people who don't have insurance? People below a certain income qualify for, or if they're elderly as well, you've got Medicare and Medicaid, and then there are all different state versions of healthcare assistance. Most people, though, are insured through their employers. But what about those people who are employed, but their employer doesn't cover any kind of healthcare costs or have an insurance plan? What about them? And they're in a particular danger because what if they get sick? Not so much like they break a leg or have an appendectomy, but what if they need prolonged cancer treatments or something like that? That's when healthcare gets extremely expensive, and it can cause devastation financially. It is the single leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States. We heard again and again. So what to do about this? And what everyone wonders too, internationally, why is it the United States lags so far behind other developed countries? I mean, all of Western Europe, Canada, Japan, they all have government healthcare plans. That is considered an essential thing for a developed country. It's clearly in the public interest. Why is it so hard in the United States? Fascinating question that has a long and complicated history. Well, okay, what's the answer here? Obama knew right away that you could not approach this the way that Hillary Clinton had, the way that George W. Bush had. It couldn't be just a big sweeping government program. All right, let's get creative, he said. And he turned to a senator, Senator Max Baucus, who was largely responsible for designing the Obamacare bill, or the Affordable Care Act bill, before it was called the Obamacare. And it had a couple of central features. One of the most important ones was what was called the individual mandate. And the idea was, and this turns out to be the linchpin of the Affordable Care Act, make sure that every single American is on a private insurance plan, not a government one, but a private one. So yeah, mandate by law that people have an insurance plan through contract. that raises a tricky constitutional question. One of the key duties of government is to protect contracts or do nothing that infringes on the freedom of contract. But can government compel you into a contract? Bacchus thought, well, yeah, it's the same thing as protecting contract. It can also require a contract if it is necessary for the common good, and it can penalize you for not having one. Don't states already do this with auto insurance? Doesn't one state at least already do this with healthcare? And that's, of course, Massachusetts. The individual mandate then turns out to be the central idea. And so, as the bill is unveiled, and one of Obama's key promises during his campaign, the individual mandate is presented to the public. Where did the individual mandate come from? It was actually from a Heritage Foundation report in the late 1980s that was a proposal for how the federal government might deal with the cost of healthcare, which back in those days was minuscule compared to what it had become. But still, this is a way to anticipate the problems of people going without health insurance. If everyone is mandated to be on a healthcare plan, especially younger, healthier people who rarely get sick, that will drive the cost down for everybody else who's in the insurance pool. So everybody's paying in, and only like 1 in, say, 10,000 people gets horribly sick, no problem. The cost of their premiums is lower, the insurance is there to cover them. That was a proposal from the Heritage Foundation, conservative organization, very important in the Republican Party. Well, by the time it's presented to the public, what do Republicans say? No, terrible idea, we're against that. They were for it since 1989. They're against it since Obamacare, says the cartoon. Why the contradiction? Well, a lot of Democrats and Obama himself said, well, clearly it's not about the idea. It's the fact that a Democrat like me is proposing it. But that's okay. The American people can see that. Let's move forward and see if we can get this off the ground. As he unveiled it to the public, a very unusual incident happened in Congress. I think one of you was going to present on this. Joe Wilson, representative from South Carolina, was in the audience as Obama was laying out what the law would do. And at one point he said, there are careful provisions in place to ensure that this does not cover people who are in the country illegally. And Joe Wilson from across the galley lost his temper and yelled out, "You lie!" And the photo is quite striking. It was interesting that the cameras were already on him. Somehow they knew he was going to say this, or maybe he was already causing a kerfuffle. And the three of them look sideways. Vice President Biden, House Speaker Pelosi, and President Obama all look to the side. And Pelosi and Biden look shocked. Obama is kind of smirking like he expected this. Of course, Wilson later apologized. This evening, I let my emotions get the best of me when listening to the president's remarks regarding the coverage of undocumented immigrants in the healthcare bill. While I disagree with the president's statement, my comments were inappropriate and regrettable. I extend my sincere apologies to the president for this lack of civility. And so started this big national discussion about civility. This is the problem in our politics, everybody started to say. We are so uncivil. And so the major question for a lot of the Republicans in the upcoming midterm election in 2010, what are you going to do to restore civility? So interesting the way that conversation went and where we're at now. Obama accepted Wilson's apology and thanked him for his ideas and said, it's all about disagreement, politics of ideas here, no problem. And it all just kind of blew over. There was another half, though, to the original Obamacare proposal. The first half was the individual mandate. The second half was what was called the public option. And here's where the plan resembled more of what you saw in places like Western Europe and Canada. The public option is basically a government-run insurance company. It functions like a private company, except it's owned and operated, and it operates by the federal government. Well, a lot of insurance companies and a lot of their lobbyists said, wait a second, we can't compete with a government entity because it's run by the government. It doesn't depend on revenue, it depends on tax dollars. We depend on revenue. This will drive us out of business, whether it performs well or not. And so the outcry over this got so intense, a lot of congressional Democrats started to back away from the Affordable Care Plan. And finally, Obama said, all right, let's drop the public option. A lot of the supporters on the left were pretty shocked at this. The public option was where Obamacare really worked. The individual mandate could eventually disappear, but still, the president recognized the problem that they were raising. If you have an individual mandate that requires you to be on a health insurance plan, and if you face a penalty for not being on one, then you're presented with a choice. Do you pay the penalty, or do you avoid the penalty by simply going over to the public option? Isn't this basically the federal government stealing potential customers from private insurance companies? Yeah, I can see that, Obama said, and to show his willingness to compromise, he unilaterally dropped the public option. Despite the outcry from those on the far left in Congress, despite those on the far left in society who wanted a public option, who wanted really just a single payer plan like we have in Britain, no, Obama was going to compromise. Still, the struggle to persuade congressional Republicans over this dragged on and on. So finally it happened in early 2010. Obama said, all right, let's all just get together and have a big public discussion. He called the Healthcare Summit in 2010 and had congressional Democrats and Republicans and a handful of pundits sit around a big round table and just talk it through. And he made his very best case for how this would actually work, that the individual mandate, again, was a Republican idea years ago, that it would get all kinds of healthy people into the insurance pools and drive premiums down, that there's really nothing radical about this. It's not a single payer plan. It's not socialized medicine. And the conversation went on and on. Still, the pushback came from a lot of Republicans, and this is when the rising star in the House of Representatives, Representative Paul Ryan, really had his day in the sun, where he laid out the fact that this is not just a question of pragmatism, Mr. President. This is a question of ideology. And the proposal on the table here with healthcare really does raise questions about the fundamental nature of government and its role in our lives. Can it force people into a contract? And there are other things in the budget that are of great concern. It's not just that the law will require people to be on a private insurance plan, there will also be subsidies necessary for people to pay for the premiums. How is that budget going to be managed? Do we know what we're getting into? But he brought it back again and again. We are dealing with fundamentally different ideas about what government is for. It's not just about pragmatism. And so the Healthcare Summit turned out to be a bit of a flop. It showed Obama's best side. He really did want to make this a democratic conversation. But at the end of the day, it turned out that ideology really is what matters in politics, or at least Paul Ryan was right about that. Also in the 11th hour, Senator Ted Kennedy passed away. After a long battle with brain cancer. Kennedy had been a long time supporter of healthcare reform, and he had argued for it for years and really insisted this had been the vision of his brother, John F. Kennedy. Finally, it seemed like there was a president and enough people in Congress to make this happen, and he passed away just before he saw passage of the bill. His seat, though, from Massachusetts in the U.S. Senate, the state had to call a special election to replace him, and the people voted for Scott Brown, a Republican. His Democratic opponent ran a very weak and flimsy campaign. So now there's a Republican in Ted Kennedy's seat, and he was prepared to vote against Obamacare. It didn't look good. It really looked like Obamacare was going to go down in flames. How to get this through? Well, as other presidents had learned, and their allies in the Senate, there are different ways to get a bill through Congress. It has to go through a procedure, especially when there's a House version and a Senate version. And the actual bill itself is the same. That's what they're actually debating. But then the amendments are different. And the amendments can change the effects of the legislation. You can't give both versions, the House version and the Senate version, to the president to sign and have him merge them together. No, you have to give him one bill. So that means it has to go to the conference committee for what's called the reconciliation process. And that's where all of the supporting Democrats and all the supporting Republicans from both houses sit down and hammer out the differences between the bill. It can be long, tedious work. But what happens in the Senate? When the initial round of legislation passes, it has to pass with 60 senators or more, a supermajority. because that's filibuster proof, and that had been the practice for years. The reconciliation bill, on the other hand, only needs to pass with 51 or more. And that is ultimately how Obamacare passed, through the reconciliation process. As a result, not a single Republican voted for the bill in the Senate. And so it was an entirely partisan move on the president's part, on the congressional Democrats' part. And so it became the law in spring of 2010. He signed it into law, and the process of implementing Obamacare begins. A lot of Americans didn't really even understand what this bill was. A lot of people really thought that it was public health care, like you see in Britain, like you see in Canada. So let's just wait until it kicks in and off we go. No, it turned out that's not actually the way it worked. Instead, it was a law that required people to get on a private insurance plan and then apply for a subsidy if you couldn't pay for it. The expectation was that each state would have to set up its own version of the Affordable Care Act, or its own office that would help people get on a private insurance plan through the Affordable Care Act, and there were a whole bunch of subsidies set aside for that. Some states complied right away, including Mississippi, which is remarkable, and all the states in red went right along with it. Others had to set up sort of a partnership with the federal government, so part of their budget went to it, and then part of the federal government's did. Others just waited and did nothing. Or they sort of defaulted and yeah, they set nothing up by default, and then the federal government did it for them. Others couldn't decide. And so by the time that the rollout came, the federal government would take control of the exchanges, as they were called within those states, and have these services in place to help ordinary Americans get on private insurance plans. Most of the time this involved websites. Most of the time it was local government kinds of things. Some of the interesting images that come out of this era were the marketing campaigns. The state of Colorado, realizing that, again, what you need on private insurance plans are young, healthy people, put out these ads in the state of Colorado that were really kind of shocking, and they got a bunch of money from the federal government to do it. Brosurance? Keg stands are crazy. Not having health insurance is crazier. Don't tap into your beer money to cover medical bills. We've got you covered. Sign up for the exchange in the state of Colorado and party on. Then there's this one. OMG, he's hot. Let's hope he's as easy to get as my birth control, she says. What's going on here? Is this how we're supposed to portray young college-age people, as these wild, promiscuous, partying, drunken fools, and we need them to pay into our private insurance plan? Wow, what's happening? Now, of course, again, this wasn't run by the federal government. This was an ad agency in the state of Colorado, but still, it got a lot of attention about, you know, where's this money actually going, and what are we assuming about young people who are paying into these private insurance plans? Well, the law passed just in time within the first 2 years of the Obama administration. November of 2010, the reaction against it was so intense that the Republicans took back the House of Representatives. John Boehner, who'd been minority leader, got up and gave this tearful victory speech. The Tea Party was largely behind this. The Tea Party, of course, had emerged back in the Bush years and became very strong in the early years of the Obama administration, arguing for this very limited government, libertarian kind of vision for American politics, very strongly opposed to the Obama administration. And so they were quite instrumental at getting a lot of these Republicans elected. And a lot of them were actually more faithful to the Tea Party than they were to the Republican Party. And they were out for total obstruction. And so the American people put the brakes on the Obama administration. Obama congratulated the Republicans, said he's ready to work with them. We'll see what happens. The other major question, though, wasn't so much from Congress, but whether or not the individual mandate was actually constitutional. A bunch of states, again, under pressure from Tea Party activists, brought suit against the Affordable Care Act in National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius. Kathleen Sebelius was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And again, the question is, can the federal government force you onto a contract by power of a penalty? What did the Supreme Court decide? The oral arguments actually went on for a couple of days. This was a very big and pressing question, certainly bigger than the Supreme Court had ever dealt with. And that summer, in 2012, the court decided the all-important question. Did it stand? Indeed it did. Obamacare survived. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, and what did he say? The Affordable Care Act is constitutional in part and unconstitutional in part. The individual mandate cannot be upheld as an exercise of Congress's power under the Interstate Commerce Clause. You'll remember that most of the New Deal, really most federal programs since the New Deal, have been based on the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8. No, said Roberts and a majority of the court. You cannot say that going without health insurance affects interstate commerce. That's a stretch. However, does Congress have the power to tax? Yes. And so the argument shifted away from the Commerce Clause to the power to tax. Now, what's intriguing is that the Obama administration never made that argument until like the 11th hour. The law itself didn't say anything about the power to tax. But still, at the last minute, the Supreme Court basically said, all right, just call it a tax and it's constitutional. And hey, doesn't the federal government and state governments use taxing all the time? Not just to collect revenue, but to compel behavior? So too can they tax here. Such legislation, Roberts said, is within Congress's power to tax. The other question, though, is about the expansion of Medicaid. Can the Affordable Care Act require the state and local government to expand Medicaid to cover the costs of the Affordable Care Act within the state? No, that violates the Constitution by threatening existing Medicaid funding. Congress has no authority to order the states to regulate according to its instructions. So the individual mandate with the penalty, gone. Expansion of Medicaid, gone. But the individual mandate itself stands if it is enforced with the power to tax. So now the responsibility shifts over from Health and Human Services to the IRS. And Obamacare survives. Though it had been said that it's not a tax, even to the point where the Solicitor General Donald Verrilli was saying that as he was presenting his case before the U.S. Supreme Court. Still, the court says, all right, just say it's not a tax and it survives. So the question of whether or not it's constitutional is whittled down to one simple thing. And so the amendment was added. Every reference to the penalty is hereby called a tax, passes through both houses of Congress, president signs it, no problem. Obamacare is fixed. Still, wasn't this an instance of the U.S. Supreme Court getting involved in the legislative process? Their job is to interpret, not to compel the writing of legislation. It's almost as if Roberts wrote the legislation himself. But what can you do? Obamacare survives. But the 2012 election was approaching, and the Republicans nominated Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. And so Romney and Obama debate all the questions, and the number one question on the table is Obamacare. Should this stand? Should the president be elected, as Romney's elected, to start the process of repealing the Affordable Care Act? Or rather, repeal and replace was the slogan in 2012, and you hear this come again in 2016, because Romney accepted, and a lot of congressional Republicans accepted, this is federal law, and it was a hard-fought federal law. We've never repealed a big federal law of this magnitude before, and so it doesn't really make sense to do it now. The representatives of the American people wanted it, so let's keep it, but let's replace it. Let's repeal it and replace it with something better. What exactly? Well, the great difficulty with Romney was, of course, that he, in his capacity as governor of Massachusetts, actually introduced the individual mandate. He worked with the Massachusetts State Assembly and signed it into law as governor. What's the difference between a tax and a penalty? It's simple. It's like the difference between Obamacare and Romneycare, he says. This doesn't look good for the Republicans. And again in the debates with Obama, Romney could criticize Obamacare. He could say it's a bad idea. And Obama could just say, yeah, thanks for your idea, Governor Romney. We're happy to try it out at the national level. And Romney's only defense was, no, this was only at the state level, not the federal level. And so Romney was defeated in 2012. That was the green light for the rollout. HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius is in charge of overseeing the whole project, and much of the Obama administration and the White House handed over responsibility to her. The main thing with the rollout was, of course, the website. And the process began in 2013. Each of the states that had already initiated the Affordable Care Act within their state had their own versions. I remember coming from California, it was Covered California. Healthcare.gov, though, was the main one. If you're not website savvy enough to figure this out, that's okay. Show up at one of the local exchanges, and somebody who works for the rollout will help you do this. And that was a major part of the budget. It was very expensive, not just setting up the whole online thing, but also paying the workers who would walk people through the steps of getting on a private insurance plan. And everybody started to sign up. And the day the rollout started, what happened with the website? It crashed. Pierce Morgan on live TV tried to log on and sign up with healthcare.gov, and he sit there hitting refresh over and over again. The website just wouldn't come back up because too many people signed on at once. What a disaster. And who was the face of the website? It was a woman who had done some modeling years before, and she found out that her picture was going to be used on the website. She never gave her full identity. She just went by the name Adriana, wanted to remain anonymous. And she was a little upset that she was like the only picture on the website. Normally you go to these kinds of websites and you click refresh and you get different people every time. But instead it was her. And she ended up becoming like the face of the failed Obamacare website. She talked to ABC News in an interview and said, "I don't know why people should hate me because it's just a photo." Indeed, people came up to her in public. So yeah, nice going with the website. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't design the website, she said. I didn't make it fail, so I don't think there should be any reason to hate me for it. Yikes. And so the administration very quickly told HHS, all right, get some other pictures up there so it's not just her over and over again. So now you hit refresh and it's all kinds of random clip art people instead. Still, it got worse and worse. Here are people trying to comply with federal law, and they're finding out that there's too many technological problems to do it. The New Yorker had probably about the funniest cover of all time, the clunky old computer, and there's Obama and Secretary Sebelius hoping that the IT guy can get the floppy disk to work. What an embarrassment. Why is this not working? Why is Obamacare so hard to roll out? Why was the Obama campaign website back in 2008 so well designed, so user-friendly that it could raise millions in campaign funds and small donations, and yet here we can't even help people comply with federal law? And then it got worse. As all of the insurance companies found out that they were no longer in compliance with certain regulations implemented by HHS, they had to drop lots and lots of their longtime customers. What an embarrassment. All the Obama administration could say was, "We're so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. This wasn't part of the plan." Kathleen Sebelius had to testify before Congress explaining we didn't know this was going to happen. Pretty soon it looked like nobody knew how Obamacare was supposed to work. Not even the president, not even Secretary of HHS. And because of this huge debacle, she had to resign. Well, as things rolled on through 2014, it got better. And more people did comply with federal law and sign up. The following tax year, the plan was that if you did not have an insurance plan, you had to prove it in your tax return, okay, you would not get as much of a return that year. And that it would increase year by year, and pretty soon it would jump up to about 6%. Pretty soon you would not be getting any tax return at all. That would slowly put the clamps on people to get out there and get on a private insurance plan. Well, as you know, by 2017, when Donald Trump comes into office, all of that is scrapped. The whole tax code within the IRS having to do with Obamacare is gone. Still, though, it seemed like it really was starting to work. The other major controversy, though, had less to do with the individual mandate and more to do with religious liberty, especially in light of one aspect of Obamacare, which wasn't actually in the federal law. It was instead a mandate that came directly from Obama himself. What is a mandate? It's kind of like an executive order, only executive orders usually have to do with rearranging the executive branch in certain ways. Mandates, though, go beyond that. They take vague parts of the legislation pursuant to the general purpose of the legislation. The president basically makes a policy with a mandate. One of those mandates was that employers had to cover with their insurance plans all kinds of things, including contraception. Most employers, okay, fine. But there were some employers that did not want to go along with this, especially religious ones. This also affected a lot of students in graduate programs and law schools that were usually covered under their insurance policies. There was a testimony given in Congress by a law school student at Georgetown named Sandra Fluke. And she laid out the situation here actually quite well. She had wanted to come testify before Congress in these hearings, and congressional Republicans said, no way, get out of here. And a bunch of Democrats coordinated some special hearings just to hear her out. And she said this: the denial of contraceptive coverage impacts real people. In the worst cases, women who need medication for other medical reasons suffer dire consequences. And then she went on in this speech to lay out all of the medical reasons that women needed access to birth control, particularly the pill, not to prevent pregnancy, but other medical reasons. Still, schools like Georgetown, who were Roman Catholic, did not want to cover birth control. She said, many women whose stories I've shared are Catholic women. Ours is not a war against the Catholic Church. It's a struggle for access to the health care we need. That's all. Republicans, though, completely misunderstood Fluke's point. Darrell Issa from California and several others didn't really read the transcript or listen to the testimony. They thought people like Fluke were saying they wanted birth control because they were very, very, very sexually active, which isn't at all what Fluke was saying. And it just kind of snowballed. It really started to look like Republicans were just very hostile toward women. And so began, in those years, what was frequently called the war on women. And so why can't Republicans win over women voters? A lot of people wondered. Well, maybe because they're sleazy and creepy, says the cartoon. Still, the bigger question was whether or not you can compel a private organization, whether a retail store like Hobby Lobby or a private nonprofit organization like Little Sisters of the Poor or any number of religious colleges around the country, to cover contraceptives that is against their religious conscience. These questions came before the U.S. Supreme Court, and as we know, the court actually ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby and in favor of Little Sisters of the Poor, the organization of the nuns. But still, it really looked to a lot of people, even though this court victory, it really looked to people like Obama was quite hostile toward religious freedom. Render unto Caesar or else, right? Sorry, but there are certain aspects of the public interest that are so fundamental, and reproductive rights is one of those things, seemed to be the argument here. And Obama stood firm on that right until the end when the Supreme Court struck down the contraceptive mandate. This was a striking turn, though, for the presidency. We had not seen the presidency get involved in reproductive rights on this level before. Presidents took certain positions when it came to abortion rights and stuff like that, but ultimately it was a question for the Supreme Court, since Roe versus Wade, and states to try to figure out. Presidents had not gotten directly involved. Obama, though, was the first one. To backtrack, though, through the course of 2011, Obama had expressed increasing frustration with what he referred to as congressional dysfunction or legislative dysfunction. Prior to this time, when presidents hadn't gotten exactly what they wanted from Congress, either because of lack of political skill or because of obstructionism in Congress, they had turned to certain executive actions to get their way. Usually, though, they were Republicans. Remember, Richard Nixon did this with impoundment. Ronald Reagan would do it with executive orders. George W. Bush also did with executive orders. But the We Can't Wait campaign was Obama's turn to the American people, claiming that he was justified in taking bold executive action when Congress was just stuck, when Congress wouldn't give him what he wanted. A lot of critics said, well, yeah, what you mean by congressional dysfunction is better known as checks and balances. But then again, if you consider the situation with Congress, the fact that Majority Leader John Boehner, after 2010, would frequently suspend votes on things, especially things like immigration policy, Obama kind of had a point. There was a problem with Congress blocking things. And so he turned to not executive orders, but to executive mandates. We talked about the contraception mandate. That was one of the bigger ones. And then a variety of others, too. When it came to dispersing funds for part of the bailouts, when it came to some of the public investments and things like that, he would basically take federal law as it existed and say that he was going to interpret it with his mandate. Bush had done this when it came to signing statements, you'll recall, that his signing statement would spin the meaning of the law to his advantage. But Obama, it wasn't about the signing statement at all. It was about the mandate. And so he issued all kinds of mandates and quite unilaterally made public policy. His explanation for this, though, without a doubt, the most urgent challenge we face right now is getting our economy to grow faster and to create more jobs. And that's why we can't wait. We cannot wait for dysfunctional Congress to do its job. And where they don't act, I will. This was a truly remarkable step in the consolidation of the power of the presidency. And we'd seen presidents find sneaky ways to get what they wanted, to try to strong-arm Congress. We'd seen them take very drastic action when it came to foreign policy. That's been around since Harry Truman's day. But never before had we seen this bold of a step in the use of mandates and the claim that we cannot wait for what's necessary coming from a president before. As a result, Obama attracted a great deal of interest group politics. Consider his relationship with Planned Parenthood. We'd never seen a president consolidate such a connection to Planned Parenthood before, certainly during his campaign and by the time he started issuing the mandates with this organization, as well as labor unions, as well as many, many others. And so because of the mandates, we started to see certain interest groups shift away from lobbying Congress, from getting their case before the Supreme Court, forget the other two branches. They started gravitating more and more to the presidency. The boldest use of a mandate that we saw in the Obama administration, though, had to do with the question of immigration, especially when it came to dreamers, as they were called. You'll recall that back in the Bush administration, Bush was the first one to really confront this, and he did it quite sensibly. What do we do about people who are in the country illegally, but came when they were kids, back when they could not have known that they were breaking the law? And then they grow up here and they go to our schools and they're used to being Americans. They think they're Americans, and then they apply for student loans to go to college, and then they find out they're in the country illegally. What do we do? Well, immigration hardliners would say, well, they ought to be deported. Well, that didn't seem to be quite the answer. That didn't seem sensible. And besides, there are millions and millions of them. How do you deport that magnitude of the population? George W. Bush knew that that was impossible. And so he had worked with Congress to try to figure out comprehensive immigration reform. Remember, twice Bush had proposed these plans that would offer a path to citizenship, the DREAM Act that would offer a way for people who had been in the country illegally for years to become citizens. And you had to admit, too, that a lot of this was because federal laws weren't being enforced years ago, so why enforce them now? Seemed to be the argument. Well, Bush just could not get it through Congress because a lot of congressional Republicans took such a hard line against this. Well, finally, the second chance came up in the early days of Obama's administration of comprehensive immigration reform and deferred action and what to do about the Dreamers. And Obama told Congress, get me results or I will take direct action. I am ready to act unilaterally on this if I have to, and I have a plan on how to do it. And it just got stuck in Congress. And finally, the big comprehensive immigration reform bill made its way through the Senate. It looked like it was going to work. And once again, it came before the House of Representatives, and John Boehner suspended the vote, which is not at all part of the legislative process. And so Obama finally announced that he had had enough threatening. In 2012, he announced deferred action for childhood arrivals. What the plan was that within the executive branch, within Immigration and Naturalization Services, all of the Dreamers would be shielded from deportation. And notice what that meant. The mandate basically changed the procedure to basically make law. But how did Obama explain this? He says this is not amnesty. This is not immunity. This is not a path to citizenship. It is definitely not a permanent fix. Nope. This is a temporary stopgap measure. Dreamers study in our schools, play in our neighborhoods, befriend our kids, they pledge allegiance to our flag. It makes no sense to expel talented young people who are, for all intents and purposes, Americans. Still, it's not a permanent fix. He did this in hopes that Congress would catch up and finally pass comprehensive immigration reform. A few years later, though, there's the Dreamers, but what about their parents? Well, that's when he also, by executive mandate, handed down DAPA, Deferred Action for Parenthood Arrivals. And so this drew a great deal of support, and it seemed to a lot of people like this was the right thing to do, but in a lot of ways it actually imperiled Dreamers even more, because the whole question of whether or not they could stay in the country hung by presidential order. All it takes is another president of an opposing party to come along and start to dismantle DACA. It's not federal law. We'll get to that on the Trump administration next time. Also through the course of his presidency was the debt crisis. The federal debt is set by Congress, and at this time it was about $20 trillion. A large chunk of that was because of the Bush tax cuts, in contrast with the increased defense spending for the war in Iraq. But the real part of it came from the bailouts that came down at the end of the Bush's administration and the first few months of Obama's administration. And then, of course, the major chunk of the federal budget was entitlements. The fact that entitlements outpaced tax revenue. And so we saw the federal debt going up and up and up. Congress set its own limit to what the debt could be. The Constitution does not say this. In fact, the Constitution explicitly says that there will be no official limit to how much the federal government can borrow from China, from the Federal Reserve. What to do, though, as we start to approach the debt limit? The first crisis came in 2011, and the argument was you have to raise the debt ceiling on one side. The other said, no, we have to raise taxes to close the deficit the way Bill Clinton did. And of course, congressional Republicans said, no, you have to cut the spending. Raise the taxes, cut the spending, raise the ceiling, raise the tax, back and forth. And they simply could not come up with a solution. So finally, the Obama administration had had enough. And then came the sequester, as it was called, which is another government shutdown like we saw back in the 1990s. Most of the things that were shut down, though, were very low budget compared to the entitlements, like national parks, like the Lincoln Monument. In response, one protester, who happened to run a gardening business, got all of his equipment and rolled his lawnmower out across the lawn in front of the Lincoln Monument and started mowing the lawn. Capitol Police came and hauled him off, said, nope, you can't mow the lawn here. Well, what finally happened with the debt crisis? The ceiling was raised, of course, and it was handed over to the Treasury Department. That Congress would comply with whatever the Treasury said the debt ceiling needed to be raised to. As we know, it is way past $20 trillion. It is now about $25 trillion. We'll talk about debt more when we turn to the Trump administration. But still, is there just no limit? Like, how high does the debt go before the dollar crashes? It seems like the dollar is actually quite stable, that we can keep borrowing, but still, there's going to have to be a serious solution to this at some point, or the debt is going to just devour GDP. Obama's position on social issues, though, were intriguing. What was his view of same-sex marriage during his campaign in the first few years of his presidency? Well, his claim was that, indeed, marriage is between one man and one woman. In fact, a lot of prominent Democrats said this. Hillary Clinton didn't change her mind until like 2013. Well, Obama announced something very interesting through the course of his presidency. Just before the 2012 election, he said, I changed my mind. I support same-sex marriage. Although he didn't say he changed his mind. What he said was, my views have evolved. So in other words, I was right when I said that marriage was between one man and one woman, but now I'm also right to say that marriage can include people of the same sex. When your views evolve, you never have to say you're wrong. And so it truly was an expression of his deep pragmatism. And so Obama came out in support of same-sex marriage, this very hot-button divisive issue through the course of his presidency. And the big lingering question about same-sex marriage, too, especially after the contraception mandate, was what about the challenges to religious liberty? We had already seen bakers, florists, fall afoul of state civil rights laws for refusing to cater same-sex weddings, following the contraceptive mandate, are we going to see even more of that? And so a lot of social conservatives started to feel very threatened by the Obama administration. He'd done his best to win them over, certainly during the campaign and the first few years of his presidency, but between this and the contraceptive mandate, he really lost them. And the real breaking point came when Obergefell v. Hodges was handed down in the summer of 2015, ruling that there is, in fact, a constitutional right to same-sex marriage under both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. So in other words, is same-sex marriage a matter of equality? Yes. Is it also a matter of privacy? Yes. This is the only issue you've ever seen combine both civil rights and civil liberties into a single thing. And so, in show of solidarity, the Obama administration lit up the White House in rainbow colors to show his support for this victory in the U.S. Supreme Court for same-sex couples who are now, their marriages are now protected under federal law, and all states must comply. This was a major breaking point, though, like we said, with social conservatives. This really was the moment when Obama just lost them once and for all. But hey, maybe he never needed them in the first place. But we'll consider how this plays out in the coming years in 2016 and the total alienation that so many social conservatives feel from progressive Democrats like Obama and, of course, Hillary Clinton. Ferguson, Missouri, you probably recall, was the scene where a young black man driving a car was pulled over by a police officer and something happened and he was shot. Of course, the interpretation of this was that, nope, this is targeting by police of young black men. This is a major, serious problem within the United States. And then it happened again and again around the country. What's going on? This was, of course, the motivation for the Black Lives Matter movement, still very much with us today, saying exactly that Black Lives matter, that police must comply, that there has to be regulations and investigations of police shootings to prevent this kind of thing. Well, the Obama administration, normally this kind of incident didn't rise to the federal level, but the Obama administration felt and really thought that it was critical to look into this. And so a federal investigation was called by Attorney General Eric Holder and the Justice Department. And the entire situation was carefully looked into in Ferguson. And the police officer who pulled the trigger was exonerated. It turned out that he had actually followed every single police procedure, and there was really nothing else to say. Still, though, the movement really picked up speed, and the doubt about police work and the racism latent in society got really, really intense. And as we know, it's still very much with us today. And so, Obama's attempts to try to create this post-racial society, to overcome all of that and leave it behind, a very beautiful idea. It turned out that so much of the way society is just much too obstinate. And most shocking of all, as we know, was the growing shift in identity politics that took place not on the left when you talk about ethnic diversity, but on the right. We start to see the rise of white nationalist groups by the end of his administration, and they become very important during the Trump years. Get to them later. Let's turn then to Obama's foreign policy. The plan was that all troops would finally be withdrawn from Iraq. He said by the end of 2009, turned out to be a little bit longer, but still, by 2011, the last combat troops, left Iraq. There's still a large U.S. presence in Iraq even today, but they are largely an advisory role for Iraqi national security. And so this was it, full transition of power over to the Iraqi government. It's done. And all of the emphasis on the war on terror shifts back to where Obama said it should have been all along, and that's, of course, in Afghanistan. Obama's major foreign policy success, though, was the assassination of Osama bin Laden. May of 2011, intelligence reports revealed that they were 99% sure they knew where Osama bin Laden was hiding out. You saw the film Zero Dark 30. You see how rigorous so much of the intelligence work is within the CIA. And so Navy SEALs located him within a compound, actually in Pakistan, and raided the compound. And instead of capturing bin Laden and bringing him back to the United States, having learned the lesson about with all the Guantanamo Bay detainees, And the fact that the Supreme Court ruled that they were entitled to a civil trial, so much better just to assassinate the target. And so bin Laden was killed. This raised all kinds of interesting questions, though. Where was his due process rights? I mean, sure, maybe it's a pain to bring him back to the United States and put him on trial. Maybe, though, the Supreme Court shouldn't have ruled that. Maybe the greater discretion should be given to the president on these questions. We might have captured Osama bin Laden and brought him back to Guantanamo Bay. The other question, of course, is, do terrorist organizations really disband when their leader is killed? They don't work around the leader, they work around ideology. But still, Obama took a great deal of credit for this. This is what the Bush administration was so unable to do all those years, and I did it. Justice has been done. Between 2010 and 2011, though, the most intriguing event in modern history, the modern Middle East, happened. There was an incident in Tunisia where a street vendor, a guy with a college degree from some European country, had come back to Tunisia, was selling fruit on the street. And he was roughed up by a bunch of police officers. And then a bunch of people in the neighborhood came out and started yelling at the police officers, and this huge demonstration erupted against the Tunisian government. And then it got so big that the officials within the government left. And then it started to spread everywhere across the Arab world. It was, of course, the Arab Spring. A whole bunch of ordinary people in Arab countries rising up and demanding that they have democratic reforms in their governments, that their longtime dictator presidents step down. Some did, some didn't, but still, all those years of the Bush administration claiming that we needed the US military and military force to spread democracy in undemocratic countries, all of that just collapsed. No, what brings democracy? The people themselves. Still, this put the US in a very tricky diplomatic situation. As it works in foreign policy, you stand by the head of state as they exist because that's the head of state. You recognize them diplomatically, they are the sovereign. Still, though, what do you do when you see these kinds of uprisings? When do you shift support for the protesters? And so the Obama administration was really stuck as the course of the Arab Spring moved forward. They continued to support the old-time leaders of those countries and recognize them diplomatically, even though they weren't exactly our friends, people like Muammar Gaddafi. But still, they're the head of state. Let's recognize them. But again, as the protests progressed, and it was very clear that those countries were turning against their autocratic leaders, the United States suddenly lifted their support for those leaders and shifted it over to the protesters. The case of Hosni Mubarak was particularly interesting. In Egypt, he was a U.S. ally. He had good diplomatic ties with the United States. The United States stood by him despite of these protests. By the time the protests were millions of people on the street, though, it was clear that Mubarak's days were numbered. And so the U.S. shifted support over to the protesters in the new regime. In the case of Muammar Gaddafi, he wasn't just overthrown, his government wasn't overthrown, he was caught in his motorcade by a bunch of protesters who dragged him out of his car and murdered him. And enough of that guy. So, the Arab Spring really showed this extraordinary power of Arab democracy in these countries. Another country, though, had a whole different situation. Bashar al-Assad had a much stronger government in Syria, and he was not about to step down under popular pressure. And so he regarded so many of the protesters as just rebels against his country, and the Syrian civil war broke out. And it has been a bloody, terrible civil war still going on today. Massive refugee crisis into Europe, and, as we know, the rise of the Islamic State. In the eastern parts of Syria, far away from the capital, a lot of the rebels ended up organizing with other radicals in the northern parts of Iraq, and they established what they thought was the new caliphate, as you hadn't seen in that part of the world since way back in the Middle Ages. And this turned out to be a particularly terrifying terrorist organization. So even though Osama bin Laden was killed off, this new organization pops up. Their interest, though, is not international terror operations so much as the establishment of a sovereign entity in the Middle East. that will be sort of the center of the Islamic world. So, very difficult and complicated times internationally. Obama, though, kind of followed suit the same way that Bill Clinton approached terror threats. You just use the technology that's available to eliminate the threat early on. While Bill Clinton used cruise missiles, though, the Obama administration preferred aerial drones. They could be flying like 50,000 feet, shoot a Stinger missile at a target with laser precision, and problem solved. But still, this raises all kinds of very complicated ethical questions. Is this really the right way to approach terror threats? Do you really know that you're hitting the target you think you're hitting? And again, much like the Osama bin Laden question, what about the due process of the victim? Isn't this giving a tremendous amount of military power into the hands of the president? The operations are extremely small, so it's not like full-scale invasion. It's not even the level of a Navy SEAL strike. But still, is there any place for Congress to try to limit or control the use of these aerial drones? Well, remember, one of the key provisions of the War Powers Resolution to try to get presidential war power under control was that he had to report to Congress, and he had 60 days to achieve his goals, and then he had to withdraw if Congress didn't extend it. Does any of that matter anymore by the time you get to aerial drone strikes? The War Powers Resolution is clearly obsolete. So, what to make of the Obama administration? The grand promise of 2008 and the early days of his presidency, the fact that he would not get stuck in ideology, that he would rise above that, he would use presidential power to guide American politics and American life to a new level. All of that seemed to be very quickly pulled down into politics as usual. A great deal of his support from 2008 ended up deeply disappointed, not so much in him, but the fact that he just couldn't overcome the way the political system was. What does this mean for the presidency? What does it mean for the future? We are down to the last administration. That is, of course, Donald Trump. He left office in 2016, endorsing Hillary, or approached the end of his presidency anyway, endorsing Hillary Clinton, who had been his Secretary of State. Tell a bit more of her story next time. And in a lot of ways was really kind of disappointed with the course of his own presidency. Not willing to shift blame to other people, but indeed, all of the optimism just really hit the realism hard during those years. He gave his farewell address to the country, and he met with Donald Trump, president-elect, for the transition team. He insisted that, yes, a Trump presidency is, of course, very different from what he had been, that it felt to a lot of his supporters that this was the end of the world, but he encouraged everyone to keep believing that what it meant to be an American was not all about who the president was. No, it was about us. His farewell address had this really remarkable statement in 2017. Politics, he said, is a battle of ideas. Quite true. That's how our democracy was designed, after all. In the course of a healthy debate, we prioritize different goals and different means of reaching them, but without some common baseline of facts, he says. Without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent might be making a fair point, and that science and reason matter, then we're going to keep talking past each other, and we'll make common ground and compromise impossible. So it was with the end of the Obama presidency. The belief that you could rise above politics as usual, that it could be more than the battle of ideas, that it could be this overcoming of the checks and balances in political discourse for the sake of progress. Now, it turns out, no, it really is a battle of ideas after all. Can we recover that battle of ideas, though, now that we tried so hard to leave it behind? Let's think about that next time as we turn to the presidency of Donald Trump. See you then.